SIMex 2021. Antes de que inicie el doctor Brion, me gustaría comentarles un poco de lo mucho, es muy extensa su currícula, su currículum, entonces voy a tratar de sintetizar. El doctor Brion es egresado de la Escuela de Medicina de la Universidad de Leicester en Inglaterra, con títulos en Química y Fisiología del Ejercicio. Graduado en Medicina de Emergencia y Ortopedia, posteriormente se graduó en Medicina del Deporte. Es profesor de investigación, tecnología e innovación médica, catedrático de anatomía clínica, especialista en educación y salud internacional, director ejecutivo del Medical Anatomic Center del Departamento de Ciencias Médicas de Anatomía de la Universidad de Western, del Departamento de Ciencias de la Salud. Es editor del Atlas de Anatomía Humana, Netter, de la quinta, sexta, séptima y octava edición, y coautor del diseño fotográfico clínico del cuerpo humano Gray. Pues, sin más que agregar, le doy la bienvenida a nombre de todo el comité organizador al doctor Brion Benninger. Sin duda, una plática que estamos esperando con mucho entusiasmo. Bienvenido, doctor. Buenos días.
Gracias, muchas gracias. There we go. So hopefully you can hear me all right. I want to thank the organizers for the SIMex 2021. This is a fantastic conference. I also want to compliment all of my colleagues who work throughout Mexico, all the academia, especially in the areas of anatomy and simulation. Certainly, in my opinion, as a country, I think perhaps the medical students are the most fortunate, the most lucky, that they have the best anatomists as a whole, I think, for a single country, better than anyone else. They really provide a lot of good clinical acumen. So I'm very grateful to be able to provide a short talk here. Like all of you, I want to thank my past and current mentors, that including students, researchers, healthcare providers, and the people who graciously donate themselves as cadaver patients as well. We always learn from them. Some of the evolving trends in simulation, what you'll take away from this interaction we have is that you'll become aware of the recent and or current trends in teaching and learning simulation, which may not be obvious as what it appears. Learn proven or developing myths to challenge the status quo. There are a lot of myths out there, and we're going to discuss some of those about the technology of remote simulation. Introduce you to a philosophy I developed for learning and teaching simulation and apply it to anatomy, just to give you examples. Points of remote simulation success. In my opinion, I believe that a person, a department, or a group who teach remote simulation must sit down and think about what is your philosophy of learning. In other words, how do your learners, what's the best way do these people learn? These future healthcare providers or current providers, and then think about the best way to teach them. I don't think those are one and the same. Often we do what's best for the teacher and not necessarily what's best for the learner. Next, equipment. We're all concerned about the cost of equipment. In order to do remote simulation, equipment has to be affordable. It has to be not expensive, but something that, because the best remote simulation is when the people that you are actually delivering any sort of simulation to have some device at their end where they can interact with you. And so, perhaps in a perfect world, if every medical student or whoever we're teaching has a headset. Now I know in US dollars, maybe that's 300 or something like that US dollars, but I think that can come down when one is buying lots and lots. And anyway, other things with equipment is the speed, how well the internet works, and so on and so forth. The delivery method is terribly important. I think the delivery, whether we're doing remote from a computer in a room out to a group of people, or whether we're in a lab and we remote it from a lab out to a group of people, it's the delivery. In other words, not just the quality that goes out, but also the chronological order. What do you do first? What do you do second? What do you do third? And do they build on themselves? Next, we must have a way to assess remote simulation success. We have to assess it. And lastly, and perhaps maybe the most important, is that we must continue to add to evidence-based simulation research so that we can evolve vertically. Again, this is how myths come about, a lot of opinions, and so we need much more research on this. The phone has probably been one of the best things for us as far as being able to do remote simulation. And as long as phones are not inexpensive, they're not cheap, they cost money, but hopefully there's ways that we can get phones to medical students and other people that we're teaching, and they just keep getting more and more robust as far as being able to do various types of simulation, whether that's AR, VR, XR, etc. So VR and AR reality, some people believe that when you combine them or you use them and integrate them, then either it's called XR, some people say MR, X for extended reality, M could be a form of mixed reality. There's not a hardcore definition for all of these, but they do cross over a wee bit. For remote simulation, COVID-19, if there is one positive thing about the COVID virus pandemic, which is an awful thing to have happen globally, but the one positive thing is that it forced everybody to become much better, and especially technology companies, at the platforms. And indeed, the Zoom platform we're using today has improved tremendously. A recent paper that was published came out and said that 1.3 billion students were removed from in-person curriculum, from medical schools globally, nursing schools, etc. 70% ended up worldwide becoming remote, okay? What I found fascinating is in Latin America, 99% had to go remote. And so it forced companies to develop, because previous to COVID, previous to 2019, even at the very beginning of 2019 of January, Zoom platforms were not terribly robust. They were not very good at all, really. One of the things that we want to do in all simulation is constantly keep getting more real or lifelike simulation. And so we must look and synchronized teaching rather than asynchronized with simulation is, at least as far as when we do various types of studies where we just ask students what they prefer, with an autonomous and they don't have to put their name down and things, it's overwhelming how they prefer the synchronized learning. And I want to touch on this so I can hit some of the early myths, and then we'll go a bit further into this. So as far as remote learning, there's people who claim, and I'm sure some of you think, that you're a visual learner. And some of you might think that you're an auditory learner. You like to listen to, hearing a lecture, listening to a presentation, etc. Some people say they're visual learners, okay? And we will discuss this shortly. Some like to read text. okay? And say if they're reading, that's their favorite way of learning, okay? We will come back to that in just a short moment. So a couple of things just as we get started here is, so technology platforms in the past 18 months have improved tremendously. We can actually start to focus on other things. Before, it was a problem as far as doing remote. Now, the platforms have gotten so robust, it's not really the problem anymore. They're able to handle bigger software programs and so on and so forth. The cost is certainly coming down. It would be my dream or hope that, you know, companies would certainly help at least those people in medical schools to get headsets that would be very, very inexpensive. And if we're trying to get donors and various people to help out large companies, that they would invest in these headsets and get them to medical students so we could provide even a better experience in remote, because the softwares just keep getting stronger and stronger. I want to make a comment here about, I'm an old school, I used to think the best way to teach, certainly the anatomy that people need to learn to be efficient, successful clinicians, is you had to come in and dissect. But I'm now a very strong believer that when I did that, I didn't have options of really tremendous 3D headset software where I could look at things in 3D and interact with it. And so at least in these past couple of years, what we've found is that if you provide a type of remote simulation with 3D, and you absolutely are teaching lots of, not only with cadaver from CT and MRIs, the imaging or ultrasound, that the first 2 years, it should be just overwhelming stimulation with remote simulation in 3D anatomy and so on and so forth. And then in years 3 and 4, this is when we've found that the students really want to come back into the lab. And actually, that's when they would probably benefit most from dissecting. They would have mental templates about what the anatomy should look like because they've been looking at it in 3D. They've been looking at cross sections and all of this, actual real ones, not modeled ones that aren't real. I mean, absolute, cross sections from actual human beings and so on and so forth. And that coming into dissect in years 3 and 4, there is a thirst by the student, a hunger for them to want to dissect. It means so much more to them. And so I think we should flip it and do dissection in years 3 and 4, but years 1 and 2, we should do robust remote simulation. Any sort of virtual reality and even augmented reality and all of the rest of it's only as good as the model data set. And so I like to use actual true cadaveric tissue, whether or live human that's been imaged, and then render it into 3D. One of the biggest improvements that we can do is the model sets that are being used are marginally acceptable as concept anatomy, certainly from a simulation point, whether you're doing skills or whatever with simulation, especially remotely, is at an undergrad level, certainly not at the medical school standard. It needs to be improved tremendously. There needs to be better segmentation and so on and so forth. A few other tips here, clinical importance, all of the remote simulation, especially if we're using vertical curriculum, which a lot of people use, we must be able to integrate concepts and use multiple texts and mediums. The timing and order that we talked about before, the balance, and remember that we're really trying to help people learn. It's not about the best way we can teach. That's one way to look at things, but the ideal way is what is the best way for people to learn? And so that's a philosophy worth thinking about. We've got to start training better providers and work with scientists in the tech industry for evidence-based medicine. I do want to say that I think the simulation world is doing that actually better than the non-simulation world at this moment. One of the other things that I think we can all think about and focus on is the andragogical approach right here, andragogy versus pedagogy. Pedagogy, if anyone knows me and understands whatever I've spoke on before, pedagogy is a way that we teach children, right? It's a philosophy of how we would teach children because of the way they would focus, and you have to keep their attention. But andragogy is how we teach adults, and that's a completely different way that adults learn versus children. And so I think we need to erase the term pedagogy. We use it all the time, but it's inappropriate. Andragogy is what we need for adult learners. We need to focus on these young adult learners and integrate a lot of psychology and educational research into this. So we're going to talk about some of the myths about simulation, and especially from the point of view that when people say, I'm a visual learner, remember we spoke about that earlier, or I'm an auditory learner, I like to listen, or I like to read text. Well, fortunately, there's been several psychologists and various people who've done some relatively in-depth work, and they discovered, and it just was published recently, that there's no relationship was determined between learning style, when people say they're a visual learner, an auditory learner, whether they're reading text, and they assess them, and their performance on reading or listening comprehension testing revealed that there was no difference. And so the take-home message from this is students don't have different learning abilities, they have different learning abilities, but not different styles. And so the key is to nurture them and to keep them focused, which means interaction when we do remote simulation. So I found this to be one of the most interesting studies just about human behavior, is that they've debunked it, that when people say, oh, I'm a visual learner, they found out that it's not true. Whether you're visual, auditory, or text, the results show that they learn the same. And so obviously, most of us know that common sense is that a combination of those. Now, granted, probably some people, they would rather see more imaging and maybe a little less text and mix that with auditory. And that might be how they learn that day quite well. But on another day, auditory might be a more powerful tool for them. And so really you want to keep things mixed, which I think is what the direction a lot of remote simulation is. It's a mix of styles and various things so that it becomes more ideal, a learning experience for the now, another thing, if you're working with companies to try to help create remote simulation, one of the things that I use, it's been successful for me, is, and I'll give you an example, is when we dissect in the anatomy lab, we dissect all the parts away and we deconstruct the body. But it's been proven that the more profound way people learn is when they build something, okay? And so simulation allows us to take things apart and remove certain parts of the body, certain structures, but also if part of your teaching or the learning experience you want to provide is that the learner must rebuild something back up, that is supposed to be the most robust way to learn. And so apply that to all of your simulation. Whatever you're using, is there an element of deconstruction initially? And then do you have any kind of reconstruction after that to enhance the learning experience? And I'll be publishing this quite soon here, but it doesn't change the philosophy and the concept that I've found terribly useful over at least the past decade with simulation, and also just in the anatomy lab without simulation. So deconstruction is fairly common. It's a traditional way of teaching. Reconstruction is not as common. However, in simulation, it can be much more common, and we can do it much more robustly. So I think simulation has such an advantage, and we need to take advantage of that, okay? And then it also allows us to use exponential technology, and we can apply that reconstruction, which that's what I love about simulation. So types of simulation that can be used in remote is, and really what I wanted to do here, all of you are terribly familiar with, excuse me, the terms dry simulation, wet simulation, mixed simulation, even wearable simulation, which I'll cover. But really what I wanted people to look at from this is, you know, we need to share between various countries and get some sort of, I think it's become quite obvious about the different types of simulation that people are trying to become aware of, and definitions of dry, wet, mixed, and so on and so forth. But I think we need to go deeper and start talking about first order, second order, third order, just like we do when we write questions, right? We have first order questions that are multiple choice type, second order, third order. And the deeper the order, or the higher number, second and third order questions, typically are more realistic, right? They typically are vignettes, and they involve very much a true clinical scenario, and force essentially the learner to actually use a type of tool where they're having to sort out various bits of information and bring it together and come up with the very best answer. And so I think we need to do the same thing with simulation. And I've tried to create a first, second, and third order simulation. And so when I'm building and I'm trying to provide a talk or presentation to some students, I look and try to see what order of, do I have enough first order mixed with second and third order? Do I have various types of simulation that's mixed in for my remote presentation? Here's wearable simulation as well, and we're all very familiar with that now. It's getting more robust. We're seeing more and more of it. That's certainly very interactive for the learner. They can be wearing the wearable simulation, and because of Zoom, we can, and they can hear us talk through it, ask them to do various things, and so it can be done remotely. We just have to get the learner and send them the wearable tool. I put this in here just because we're all somewhat familiar with this very famous painting, about the anatomy lesson. But what I want people to really focus on is, and if you can see the cursor here, you see a couple of these alleged students right here, and they're watching the dissection. Okay, it looks like these two students here are really looking, if you look at their eyes, they're looking more as if they're looking over here, perhaps at the textbook, trying to look at, maybe there's an image in there. Certainly, this particular student in the far back here might actually be looking at and listening to the instructor, because perhaps they can't even see this actual dissection here. My point is that I think what this reveals is, at any one moment, some of these people are looking at what's happening, some are focusing on the listening, some are looking at the textbook. And I think this is exactly what we need to think about when we're providing remote simulation, is, are we providing them with stimulation where they're getting the visual, the audible, and the text, and it's a very good marriage and a mix of all of that. So for remote simulation, I've done remote simulation from my own office in my home. I've gone into the medical institution, into the lab, and I use ultrasound and various other types of amazing technologies to provide simulation to the students remotely. And so there's different options of what we would call remote. From one's home, it'd be slightly different than, and again, I've done it there using a virtual headset. Certainly when I'm in the lab, we send various other types of, this is a robotic haptics, fantastic bit of simulation that the students can all see what this person is doing. And we've asked this person, one side is an ultrasound, the other side is a needle, and they're feeling the haptics, and everyone can watch them and assess them almost as if they're in the room with them, but they're not actually in the room. They're watching the person do it. So that's one. Here's an interesting thing I wanted to show was, you can see this is a small little handheld ultrasound by GE. The amount of YouTube videos where people say, just place the probe here. But if anyone's ever done ultrasound, you'll find that 1 millimeter makes an enormous difference on the image that you're acquiring. And so when YouTube just shows us these things and they go, just place it here, the student struggles and rarely can actually reproduce and get the image. But once we start to create drawings, and I use the type of plastic surgery pens, and I draw on a patient and map out the ultrasound and show this to them, and we do it with multiple cameras, but I remote this out to all the students, and usually anywhere up to 330. And I go through and I talk about exactly what are the landmarks, how to find, it doesn't matter the size or shape of the morphological shape of the patient, and go through and talk about the transverse sternal line right here and these other lines, and figure out, when we're doing the EFAS exam for the upper right quadrant, where that 8th intercostal space is just here in the anterior axillary line, and then the 10th intercostal space, and then here, and actually this would be a little bit lower down, but for visual purposes, I drew the line a little higher, that blue line, which is the posterior axillary line. But once I've actually demonstrated that to them, and then I actually start to then superimpose the images and remote this out to them, and then it's live where they can either ask a question, because I'm doing this synchronously live to them, or they can go into the chat and I have a person monitoring the chat. So we really want to get away from static simulation, if at all possible. Students have said overwhelmingly that they don't desire it. They fatigue very quickly. They don't like when you're just, they're not interacting with it. Here's an ultrasound finger probe where I helped design a probe here, and you just place it on your finger and you can start to, and again, I use this on a particular patient or a volunteer patient and begin to remotely simulate this. So one of the things I wanted to get across was, I think one of the problems with people when they're doing remote simulation is they tick certain boxes. Oh, I have 50 minutes to do this, so am I doing this in 50 minutes, and so on and so forth. And I think what we need to do is quit thinking about ticking certain boxes and so on and so forth, but actually looking at, is there a skill set or some sort of interaction that the student can actually have, which keeps their attention. And so, again, have a planned philosophy. Sit down and think about, do you have deconstruction and reconstruction in the way you approach your simulation and what you're trying to achieve? Are you looking at the way that millennials learn, the techniques that they learn best? Is that incorporated? In other words, in my remote simulation teaching, I stop about every 12 minutes and give them a 1 or 2 minute break to check their emails and things like this, because I want it to be interactive. So I want them to stay engaged. I don't want them to turn off their screen and play with their phone and check their phone and try to multitask and listen to me while they're checking their phone. When they know I'm going to give them a minute or so to check phone and do various things, then they typically stay much more engaged. And I ask them, to keep their screens on. I certainly take a very andragogical approach and look at all my sim material that I'm presenting. I approach a cognitive load theory. And what do I mean by that is it's been quite well proven that, you can overstimulate people. So whenever you're doing something remotely, I never put on more than 3, and I use that term, 3 items. So in other words, I might put up an X-ray or a CT scan, an MRI, an ultrasound, whatever, but I only highlight 3 structures, even though there might be 60 structures available to see. I only highlight three things that I chat about, 3 structures. And that's the most. Sometimes it'll just be 2. But I found that if you keep it to 3 or under, then it's from a cognitive point of view, it seems to be assimilated very well. When we put on 20, 30 different labels, even if it's beautiful, it just doesn't register as well with them. And then I try to make it an enjoyable experience and not just provide a service. I think when I first qualified and I was teaching, it was almost more of a service, go do this, even though I loved it and I enjoyed it. But now I've made it so that it's an enjoyable experience, or at least I hope it is. Certainly it is for me. Do not get bogged down in this, but I just wanted to make a comment. When COVID first hit and we were all having to do various presentations, and certainly I was doing remote presentations, I sat down and we started doing some assessing to see how well Microsoft Teams, or if you're using a Mac, if you're using a PC, and this is with a VR presentation. And I just assessed the latency, the uploadability, and again, GoToMeetings on a Mac, GoToMeetings on a PC using a VR. Also, I checked against Discord. So many of you who are big time gamers know that Discord is a very, at least at that time, 18 months ago, most people would say is a much more robust platform than these other 2 common platforms. We looked at Zoom and various other things. And I can say that literally about every 2 to 3 months when we would check this, these platforms became better and better. In other words, they uploaded more quickly. There was a shorter latency period. And it's now got to the point where if you look at several of these across the board, there really is very little difference, at least that we can ascertain and see. And so it's fantastic, which from a remote point of view, that's one of the great things that COVID did, right? It forced these companies to improve their platforms, okay? Here, just another useful thing, I use Google Glass. And there's a way that you can use Google Glass and again, reach out to people. Here's an example where on the left is using an ordinary camera in a lab. And I'm about ready to show someone, about how to do a physical examination or how to palpate, or perhaps how to palpate and where to place an ultrasound probe if you're looking for a particular structure or structures. And so on the left here, I'm calling that, let's call that the bird's eye view from the camera. But on the right here, I'm wearing the Google Glass. And so as I approach the patient, that's what the student sees. Now I'm showing you a static image here, but the student sees this live, sees me moving. And when I put my hand up, they see my hand as if it's their own hand touching the patient. On the left, if you're examining somebody, then what happens is the person's body gets in the way. You have to hopefully see where their hand is at, and it's not as convenient. And so anyway, I did a very quick study on asking people what they preferred. I didn't tell them which one was using the glass first person view and which one was the bird's eye view. And it was well over 95% chose view 2, which was the glass view or first person. And so here you can see an example, okay? And so people preferred view V2. When I say people, I mean students. And again, it's so much easier for them to see when I'm discussing or talking about a certain palpation, certainly when I'm putting the probe on. And so you can use GoPro. You don't need to use Google Glass. I've used GoPro a lot. GoPros have come down in cost. They're really inexpensive, easy to use. And so GoPro is a fantastic tool, or you can use Google Glass. Here I'm using the Google Glass and I'm assessing. So I've gone into the cadaver lab and you can actually still ask students remotely, I'm grabbing a tissue here. Now, the one they see gets expanded so they can see this even better. And there's a vignette that says, you know, something such as, this person has a pulled groin. The forceps are holding the most common pulled groin muscle, name this structure. And so this is indeed the adductor longus. But, you know, this is a great way to actually give remote examinations using cadaveric tissue, but interacting. And they see me move the tongs and the tweezers. And so it's very live and interacting, and it's as close as them actually being there. So it's a form, and I can also, besides them seeing the text that they can read, I can also audibly provide the vignette and the question. Here I am performing triple feedback. Triple feedback is my hand is palpating here on the lower right quadrant of an abdomen here of someone who just volunteered and said, yes, please, you can do this. Right there's the ultrasound. And so I'm able to, with one eye, watch what's happening here, also look at the patient. The other eye, I'm actually looking at what's deep here because this is ultrasound coming here. Students, when I'm doing this remotely, can actually see, because we have another camera actually on the screen, they actually get to see it on the screen at the same time. And so we have a split screen. And while I'm doing it live, they're getting to see not only where I'm placing the probe, but also what the image looks like. And they also get the my auditory, I'm talking about it, what I'm doing, and they also get to interact at the same time. And so it's fascinating. I wanted to bring this up just to let you know that I use the Ring security system, at least in the United States at the moment. It's relatively cheap. When I say relatively cheap, you can get it for under $100. And that would not be the full package. You can get stuff that I think they're up to $200 or more, but I just bought one that was one of their more inexpensive ones. And I was going to be in New Zealand teaching, but I had some students that still wanted me to teach back in Oregon. And so I set up this Ring system, and I was able to use my phone. They set the Ring system up, which was 180-degree pan view, and I could absolutely see what the students were doing. And I had them practicing with different ultrasounds, and I could actually see them doing it. And then they could hear me through their phones. And so it was phenomenal. And this is very, very inexpensive. And we proved that you could do it, you know, about 9,000 miles away. So that was just using, and so that was what I would call disruptive innovation. I used a security system called Ring, and I use it to help do remote teaching. And in this case, I was teaching a combination of ultrasound and anatomy. At least people have said we were the first people to do wearable ultrasound. And I'm absolutely convinced that's very accurate. I had the very first wearable ultrasound. It was a wireless ultrasound, just went on my finger, and was able to do a number of things. Here you can see this one here. I put a wire on this particular one because I wanted it to go into a big screen so they could see it. But this is actually just this part here and it feeds this to a beamformer that's on my forearm. But this one here, I have it feeding into a large screen so they can see what I'm actually, and I'm palpating a person's neck here as if I'm going to do a thyroid examination. And it allows them to see not only the common carotid artery, the IJV, at least the short axis for the internal jugular vein, but also come over and see the thyroid gland. And what you're seeing here, and I apologize. The reason why I have cardiac resuscitation there is I actually believe that we're going to be able to start when someone's doing cardiac compressions, we can actually monitor right here how much blood is going through the common carotid. And I think part of resuscitation very soon, in other words, I'm trying to work with certain companies, certainly this year or the next year, that we actually have a way where we will be able to hook up a type of ultrasound to the common carotid while resuscitation is being performed and be able to assess the amount of blood flow going up, which is going to be feeding the brain. And the value of that is we'll be able to tell the person who's conducting to absolutely move left, move right, move over. And so again, we can do this remotely for teaching purposes. Again, here's the long axis they can see. Just wanted to show you here that, you know, when I'm doing ultrasound and I'm showing them remotely, I kill several birds with one stone here. I try to show them that IJV stands for internal jugular vein, the CA is the common carotid artery, and then LN stands for the lymph node, the SM is the sternocleidomastoid up here, and T is the thyroid. And I think what happens is a lot of our students, there's a disconnect. You know, they think of our neurovascular bundle, or certainly common carotid and the IJV with that vagus, and then thyroid is a totally separate thing, but they're very intimate with each other. And actually, if you then throw in the trachea, you learn three things in one go very quickly with a lot of clinical acumen. So here's the thyroid on either side. Here's the trachea with the hyperechoic rings right here. But I'm now teaching them, you know, when we do an ET tube intubation, how to use ultrasound to see if you're actually if you're in a loud area, busy city street with a lot of noise. It's hard to tell if you're intubating by the roadside, on a plane, in a busy emergency room, you know, where you still, even with noise canceling stethoscopes, it may be very difficult. And ultrasound can be your best pal. And so here again, you can see the three. There's the trachea here with the rings. There's the thyroid gland, and here's that neurovascular bundle. And they're landmarks. I mean, it's just extraordinary what I can help and teach them. So this is a form of AR. You've seen this before, where, you know, our students can put a mark. They download an app, and right there you're seeing this is a tattoo app, right?
If I go back,
Well,
run into this.
let me just go to right.
Also shrink it as well.
What we're doing next is where we draw the lines. I'm now drawing lines on the tendons, and now it's coming up our tendons. And so again, remotely, students can actually put this using their phone, and this app that we're developing, they'll be able to just download this app and actually be able to look at the arrangement of tendons and the relationship of the median nerve and the radial and ulnar artery, their branches with that. Here again is, this is Toltec technology, which they work with a lot of companies. And you can see here where, again, you can apply, instead of just randomly asking them to find something, you can actually create a way to do the deconstruction and the reconstruction in such a way that it becomes a more robust learning tool. And this is not mega expensive or fancy or anything of that sort. This is, you know, it still takes a VR headset and that sort of thing for sure. But they've just come down tremendously with our apps. We're able to do a lot of things. Let's see here. Again, just giving you some examples here. And I like this, especially when this isn't even on cadaveric tissue, but I'm able to superimpose. And what you can actually see is the depth of the aorta in the thorax and the abdomen, and see how it becomes more superficial and so on and so forth. And so just to get a 3D image and where the heart is located, and just to get a feel for these vessels. And this is just superimposing it on, and you've all seen this. I mean, this is nothing terribly special, but has a lovely effect when you're doing it remotely. Same thing here. Again, just showing them on a mannequin how you can superimpose using the VA sector, which is from Toltec. I find it just an incredibly valuable tool to use remotely. Many of my colleagues in Mexico at the different institutions there have a Sectra visualization table. You can actually use this software with the visualization table, just allows you to do even more robust 3D activity, do deconstruction and reconstruction. And similar thing here. So now we actually have an actual cadaveric tissue. But just to show you how one can very quickly here, but if you plan it out, you can do a deconstruction, and then you ask the student or a group of students, about reconstructing and putting it back in a certain way. And you can ask them like what nerve would be on top of it, or what's below it or above it or next to it. And also in a way where you help them to learn and appreciate. And here you can see where cross sections are going through, and I call these fly-throughs. So again, this is actually on the visual human. And so everybody has access to this. And you can just leave behind just the venous system or the nervous system or both. And so it keeps giving them these 3D templates and the orientation of these, which I think is tremendous before they actually go into the lab to do actual dissection, and really helps them to get a better appreciation of imaging. Again, here, right next to just a simple, next to a skeleton. Just so I don't go over, this is my last one here, but I just wanted to say that I think I'm preaching to the choir. People in simulation are really, I think the COVID was our very best friend. Continue being creative. Don't be afraid to fail when you're trying your remote simulation, and just keep your passion about it. Work with companies. And my goal is just to keep things getting cheaper and more simple, and yet we can teach tremendous concepts and really help our future healthcare providers. Again, thank you so much to all the people who've worked so hard to put this on. I think SIMex is a fantastic conference. And again, I can't say enough positive things about my colleagues who work at the institutions throughout Mexico. It's a privilege really to be able to be on the same platform with these people. Thanks very much.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Le agradecemos mucho su plática y no sé si nos pudiera pasar a lo mejor un correo de contacto por si alguien de los espectadores gusta contactarse con usted.
Samuel, selecciona el idioma español. Samuel, selecciona el idioma español para que te escuchen.
A ver si, ahora, muchísimas gracias, doctor. Estuvo muy interesante su plática, le agradecemos su participación y nos gustaría saber si pudiera proporcionarnos un correo de contacto para alguno de los espectadores.
Yeah, I apologize. Is there a translator? I picked up some of it, but not all of it. Oh, I can say that I will put this PowerPoint up and certainly put all of the links and the various things where you can get the equipment I use and so on and so forth. I can provide that and send it, and they can put it on the SIMex website.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias por todo y entonces nos vamos con la siguiente charla.
Let's see here. Yeah, I apologize. I think there was a translator, but I don't know if they're still on or not. Okay. Gracias.
Okay.
I think the translation is failing a little bit, but thank you, Dr. Benninger. I hope we can have that email for all our viewers. And thank you again for everything. If you want to continue watching our next participant, you can put on the channel in English so the translation can go on. Thank you, Dr. Benninger. Again.
Oh, I should have put the channel on earlier, then I could have.
Yeah.
I apologize.
In interpretation, you have to choose the English channel so you can hear us.
Gracias.
Don't you worry, Doctor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and tell people I can send you the, all of the links of the simulation that I use and its cost and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Of course, Doctor. Thank
Nena,
you.
¿le puedes decir al doctor Benninger, por favor, que muchas gracias, que él tiene el contacto del comité organizador de SIMex y que por ese medio puede hacernos llegar y que compartimos con todas las personas